This is Lesson 13.5, Religious Violence. What were the causes and consequences of religious violence, including riots, wars, and witch hunts? So that should be exciting. And we have already seen a couple of religious wars, haven't we? We've seen the territorial wars in Switzerland between cantons, and we've also seen mention of the wars that Charles V, Emperor Charles V, and the Holy Roman Empire fought against his Lutheran nobles called the Schmalkaldic Wars. And we're going to see a really big one this time, the French Wars of Religion. And then in Lesson 15.1, we're going to see a massive blowout called the 30 Years' War. And so we've got College Board Topic 2.4, explain how matters of religion influenced and were influenced by political factors from 1450 to 1648. We've seen that one before. Issues of religious reform exacerbated conflicts between the monarchy and the nobility, as in the French Wars of Religion. A few states, such as France with the Edict of Nantes, allowed religious pluralism in order to maintain domestic peace. And if that sounds abstract to you, just wait till you get to the end of this lesson, and that will make much more sense. Then you've got College Board Topic 2.6, 16th Century Society and Politics. Explain how economic and intellectual developments from 1450 to 1648 affected social norms and hierarchies. Reflecting folk ideas and social and economic upheaval, accusations of witchcraft peaked between 1580 and 1650. So we're going to be looking specifically at France and the Netherlands this time, 1559 to 1598. Lots to talk about here. From 1562 to 1598, it was a time of incredible religious violence in France. Look at this map. This map kind of tells you what's going on. Calvinism spread rapidly in France until France was about 10% Calvinist. Let me just point out, French Calvinists were known as Huguenots, or you can call them Huguenots, either way. So, in other words, Huguenots were Calvinists. They were French Calvinists, and they had communities in every major French city. Catholics and Huguenots competed with each other for cultural and political dominance throughout France. Each religion saw the other as evil and poisonous, and the level of violence and brutality on both sides was extreme. This event became known as the French Wars of Religion. It was also called the Huguenot Wars, or Huguenot Wars, whichever one you want to do. 3 million, that's 3 million lives were lost over the course of these wars between 1562 and 1598. So this war was fought at all levels of French society. The grassroots level of regular Catholics and Huguenots fought right up to the very top of French nobility and French royalty. And at the top of society, you actually had two warring noble families representing two warring religions fighting for control of the French throne. You had the Catholic family of Guise, and these were Counter-Reformation supporters. We talked about the Counter-Reformation last time. They were very aggressive, very militant. And then on the other side, you had the Huguenot, the Calvinist family of Bourbon. And so both families were related to the French crown. Both had claims to the throne, should the current monarch who was on the throne at the time die. So the background of the French Wars of Religion. France and the Holy Roman Empire had been competing with each other for decades, as we know. We already saw how Charles V fought the French and the Ottomans while at the same time trying to uphold Catholicism in his Holy Roman Empire. And so Charles V was a Habsburg. Charles V was also Charles, King of Spain. And France always felt surrounded and hemmed in and threatened by the combination of Holy Roman Empire, Spain, and the Netherlands, all of which were ruled by one enemy monarch, Charles V. So this competition expressed itself in decades of fighting for dominance over Italy. And this war in Italy between the Habsburgs and the French was called the Habsburg-Valois War. You could also call it the Italian War. You can also call it the last Italian War. If you look at this map of the time period, it's easy to see that France was so hemmed in by the Habsburgs that Italy was really the only option they had for gaining any kind of leverage against their Habsburg adversaries. France, which was ruled by the Valois family, fought against the Holy Roman Empire, which was ruled by the Habsburg family, for control of Italy. France also fought against Habsburg-ruled Spain in Italy. And France also fought against Italians and the Pope in Italy. So finally, France got so deep in war debt that it had no choice but to acknowledge defeat and quit that war. And so King Henry Valois, Henry II of France, signed a treaty called the Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis in 1559. And France had to acknowledge Habsburg Spain as the victor in Italy. And so Spain got control of Italy. And there's a picture here of them celebrating the signing of the Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis right here. And so in France, there was a big jousting match to celebrate the Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis, and Henry II loved jousting. And so the French king, Henry II, he's a Valois, he accidentally got a splinter from a shattered lance in his eye that went into his brain at a jousting match. And the other guy, the guy who actually did it, the Count of Montgomery, he felt really bad. He asked the king to order his head and hand to be cut off as punishment. But Henry II, who was actually still alive and still conscious at the time, told Montgomery that it was not his fault. These things just happen. And so the king stayed conscious up to the bloodletting that the doctors performed. Scientific revolution hero and human anatomy pioneer Andreas Vesalius was actually brought all the way from Brussels to be one of Henry II's doctors. So that's an important connection right there. Very interesting. Henry II's wife, Catherine de' Medici, she's a Medici. She stayed by his bedside the entire time and kept the king's mistresses from coming to visit him and bother him. They had been married since they were both 14 years old, but Henry II died a few days later at the age of 40. And this left the Valois monarchy, consisting of Henry II's wife and 3 sons, in a weak position for the next 4 decades. The French noble families, both Catholic and Huguenot, took full advantage of this weakness that was left by Henry II's death. To go any further in this, we need to understand what the concept of politique is. Politique was a very influential political policy theory in France. And politique is the view that the interests of the state come first before any religious considerations, and that the country needs a strong politic monarchy in place to hold things together. In other words, the security of the nation is more important than which religion should be on top. And politique argues against religious extremes, and it promotes religious moderation on both sides for the sake of the nation. So both Catholics and Protestant Huguenots can be politiques. When you've got these two religious extremist families, the Catholic Guise family and the Protestant Calvinist Huguenot Bourbon family, competing for political power, it's going to soon be about religious freedom in France. The Valois monarchy, who was still holding on to the throne, was caught up in the middle of this conflict between these two religious family factions. The monarchy was led by the mom, Catherine de' Medici. Unlike either the Guise or the Bourbon families, the Valois family were moderate Catholics and politiques. Luckily for them and for France, they were also surrounded by party politique members. So the party politique, what was it? These were high-ranking Frenchmen who believed in the principles of politique that we just talked about. And the party politique was made up of both Calvinist and Catholic nobles. And the party politique, like the French monarchy, was also led by the Queen Mother, Catherine de' Medici. Her family of origin was the very same family who had been running the city of Florence during the Renaissance. And so you've got the Queen Mother, Catherine de' Medici, and her three sons, and when they reigned. First son was Francis II, and he reigned for a very short time, 1559 to 1560, died very quickly. Then you got Charles IX, the second son, ruled from 1560 to 1574, so that's about 14 years. And then you finally had the third son, Henry III, 1574 to 1590, so that's about 16 years. Another good term for politique, it means kind of the same thing, is reason of state. Reason of state, and we'll talk about this more with Cardinal Richelieu, means that you do your reasoning based upon what the state needs, not based upon what some extremist faction needs. And party politique recognized that France was religiously deeply divided. They believed that the only way to effectively rule was to keep religion out of politics, and they wanted to preserve state authority, and they wanted to preserve royal authority, and they realized that if religion ever became an active element in the government, it would tear French society apart. France had been staunchly Catholic ever since the Middle Ages, and Calvinism was technically illegal in France, but John Calvin was sending missionaries into France by the hundreds, and by the 1560s, there were 2,000 Calvinist congregations practicing openly in France. Huguenots made up about 10% of the French population by this time, and many nobles saw Calvinism as a means of political opposition to the somewhat new Catholic monarchy. And so these nobles were turning to Calvinism. The Guise family. The Guise family were ultra-Catholic. They didn't believe that the French Valois monarchy was committed enough to the Counter-Reformation, the Catholic Reformation. And that made some sense because the Valois monarchy was practicing politique, trying to keep religion out of state affairs as much as possible. The Guise were also allied with the Jesuits, and they were also allied with Philip II of Spain rather than the Valois monarchy in France. They wanted the French throne. They wanted to use the throne as a tool to wipe out Calvinism, and they wanted to further the goals of the Catholic Reformation. Here's the problem you run into when you are a practicing politique in France during this religiously volatile time. The key to success for the Valois family of French monarchs was going to be staying out of and avoiding religious conflict between the Catholics and the Huguenots. And this is true whether that Valois monarch was Francis II, who ruled from 1559 to 1560, or whether you were Charles IX, who ruled from 1560 to 1574, or whether you were Henry III, who ruled from 1574 to 1590. But the problem with all that is that staying out of religious conflict also made the king appear weak, because he couldn't take sides, and he didn't have the leeway to defend his own religion, which was Catholicism. He was always in danger of looking timid, looking indecisive, looking ineffective, and looking downright wishy-washy. The Massacre of Wassy. In 1562, the noble family of Guise hatched a plan to provoke an all-out religious war in France between the Catholics and the Huguenots, which the Guise planned, of course, to win. Guise troops massacred an entire Huguenot congregation in the small town of Wassy. The plan totally worked. The Guise family got their war with the Huguenots exactly like they wanted. The war. The Huguenots were outnumbered. So when you're outnumbered, you avoid open warfare. So instead, they wore down Catholics through small raids. And in 1572, this was 10 years later, war had been going on for 10 years. It looked like Huguenot tactics were working. Now, the Valois family that was on the throne, that monarchy, had been caught in the middle of all this war, managing not to take sides for 10 years now. And the newest Valois king was now the 22-year-old Charles IX. And so what could be done to finally put a stop to all of this religious war and violence and save France from tearing itself apart? How about, we've seen this before, a marriage? A marriage is arranged between Charles IX's Catholic sister, Margaret Valois, and Huguenot leader Henry of Navarre, also known as Henry of Bourbon. So now we got this marriage between the Valois family and the Bourbon family, and maybe that will heal France and put an end to this war. The idea is to reconcile the two sides of this war, Catholic and Huguenot, with a marriage between these two people, Henry and Margaret. Well, that brings us to the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. The St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre began on August 24th, 1572. The ultra-Catholic Guise family stood to lose their bid for the French throne if this marriage were to go through. So what the Guise family did was they went to Charles IX and they told him that there was a plot to dethrone him. And Charles IX, who was only 22 years old at the time, asked the Guise family how they knew that such a plan was afoot. And they said, well, just look around. Look around at how many Huguenot leaders there are in Paris right now. There's your proof. There must be a plot to dethrone you. Well, all of these Huguenot leaders were in town to attend the wedding. It wasn't a plot. But Charles IX, at the age of 22, was duped into ordering his bodyguards to go out and systematically kill tons of Huguenot leaders. And this slaughter lasted several weeks. It spread all over the city of Paris and then went out into the countryside. And anywhere between 5,000 and 30,000 Huguenots were killed. And it seemed like a brilliant stroke of success for the ultra-Catholic Guise family. However, the reaction to this massacre was severe. The Guise family had hoped to cut off the head of the Calvinist snake by doing this massacre. Instead, they outraged Protestants all over Europe. And Henry of Navarre, our groom, the guy that was getting married, right, Henry of Bourbon, Huguenot leader, was captured, imprisoned, humiliated, and forced to convert to Catholicism. But then he converted back to Calvinism as soon as the Guise family let him go. But the massacre caused the Huguenots to fight even harder on to victory. And most importantly, guess what? You know what? Awesome. Henry of Navarre and Margaret Valois still managed to get married in spite of it all. Don't know how they did it. So the wars of religion in France evolved into the War of the Three Henrys, which went on from 1587 to 1589. Wars often tend to kind of morph into other wars. And the three Henrys involved in this war were Henry III. He's the Catholic Valois king of France. He's a politique. His brother Charles IX had died in 1574. Henry of Guise, the radical Catholic Reformation leader, and Henry of Bourbon, the Huguenot leader and hero, also known as King of Navarre, who had married Margaret Valois in 1572. So the French king, he's the French King Henry III's brother-in-law for the last 15 years by this time. Well, the Guise family were starting to lose the war that they had started way back in 1562 with that massacre at Oissy. And they began to seek foreign allies such as the Jesuits and Philip II of Spain, who was forming what they called the Holy Alliance. And their goal was still to wipe out Calvinism and to assume total power in France. In other words, get their hands on the monarchy. And as we know, Philip II, King of Spain, sent the Spanish Armada to depose that heretic queen, Elizabeth I, in 1588. We already heard about that. And we already know that Philip II lost half of his armada. And we already know that Philip II failed to depose Elizabeth I. And this seriously weakened the Catholic cause in France because the Guise family's ally, Spain, had taken such a huge blow. The turning point King Henry III and his brother-in-law, Henry of Navarre, formed a pact. They would first have Henry of Guise assassinated, which they did, and then King Henry III of France, Valois, Catholic, politique king, would sign a will naming of all people his brother-in-law, Huguenot leader, Protestant, Calvinist, Henry of Navarre, to be his heir to the French throne and be the next French king. Of all people, a Protestant. But then in 1589, the last Valois king, Henry III of France, was himself assassinated by a radical monk who was mad at him for assassinating Henry of Guise. And now for the greatest irony of all. Catholic France had a Huguenot king in the middle of a religious war between the Catholics and the Huguenots. Henry of Bourbon, King of Navarre, was to become Henry IV, King of France. He's a Calvinist. He's a Huguenot. Calvinism is illegal in France, and the French king is a Calvinist, but he's also a politique, and now even more so. This could either be a disaster or an opportunity to end this conflict for good. What does Henry IV, a Calvinist leader, a Calvinist hero, and now the Calvinist king of a Catholic France do? Well, this was not an easy transition. It took Henry IV 4 years to establish himself as king. The Catholics in Paris refused to accept him or any Protestant king. You cannot call yourself a French king by any stretch if you don't have Paris. There were many various battles and sieges along the way during this 4-year period. In 1593, 4 years after being named king, Henry IV, committed Huguenot, converted to Catholicism. He sacrificed his personal commitment to Calvinism and became a Catholic in order to save Calvinism in France and save France himself. He did not want to convert. He loved being a Calvinist. He believed in Calvinism, but he did it to unite and save France. Henry IV also had to convince the people of Paris that he was sincere about his conversion before they would capitulate and let him enter the city. And all of us gives us more context to Henry IV's immortal words, "Paris is worth a mass." He was referring specifically to Paris's willingness to accept him as king. And we have a picture of him on this slide. Henry IV finally allowed to enter Paris after the people of Paris are convinced that he is sincere about being a Catholic. Paris was a tipping point for Henry's ascension to the throne of France. Once Paris found him acceptable, other towns did too, and Pope Clement VIII even removed his previous excommunication of Henry IV from when he had become a Huguenot. So Henry IV was officially crowned king in 1594. In the year 1598, Henry IV, now a Catholic king of France, pronounced the Edict of Nantes on behalf of the people he had been one of and had fought for and had been a hero to for so many years. And the Edict of Nantes made Calvinism legal in exactly 150 specified French towns, and Paris would not be one of these towns. Calvinists were now protected from persecution in these 150 towns. Calvinists could now bear arms, they could carry weapons, and Calvinists could even fortify these 150 towns. After 36 years of war and 3 million deaths, the French wars of religion were finally over. And then Henry IV set about the task of building an absolute monarchy in France based upon the politic platform and based upon reason of state. The Netherlands under Charles V. What was going on up north of France in the Habsburg Netherlands during the French Wars of Religion? Well, this is the story of how the Netherlands became an independent nation, successfully breaking away from Spanish rule. Charles V was the heavily Catholic Holy Roman Emperor who tried and failed to keep the Holy Roman Empire Catholic. Charles V had inherited present-day Netherlands and Belgium. Present-day Netherlands and Belgium look like this on this map. The area was divided into 17 self-governing provinces. Each province made its own laws and collected its own taxes, and they're all united in that they had Charles V as their emperor. And Charles V had actually grown up in this area, and their cities were centers of trade and commerce, and the Netherlands also was a hotbed of Renaissance culture, as we've learned. So the Netherlands were heavily influenced by the Protestant Reformation. The Catholic Church was highly corrupt in the Netherlands, and so Protestant ideas were catching on, especially Calvinism. And as we know, Charles V abdicated from the throne of the Holy Roman Empire in 1556 after he failed to defeat Protestantism in the Holy Roman Empire. And in 1555, as we learned, the Treaty of Augsburg was signed, and Charles V left the Netherlands to his son, Spanish King Philip II, the Spanish Armada guy. And as we already know, Philip II of Spain was the devout Catholic who would send the Spanish Armada to invade England in 1588. Charles V may have wanted to make sure that the place where he grew up would be in the hands of his son, Philip II. And the Peace of Augsburg said that Philip II, as Lord of the Netherlands, got to decide what religion the Dutch would be. And remember, that's a hallmark of the Peace of Augsburg. You know, whatever lord or whatever prince is in charge of an area is the one who gets to decide what religion the people will practice. Well, Philip II was a Catholic, while the Dutch were really loving Calvinism right now. And so by 1560, the majority of Dutch people were Calvinists. And you can imagine the impact of this Reformation thing in the Netherlands, with a majority of Calvinist population, with a foreign Catholic king, Philip II, with the Peace of Augsburg in place and what it specified, with great wealth from all the trade and all the commerce that they were engaged in all around the world, with all of the urbanization that was going on in the Netherlands. All of this was going to result in nothing less than a war for political independence in the Netherlands. So why did Renaissance-influenced industrious bankers, merchants, and artisans gravitate to Calvinism so enthusiastically? Well, Calvinism was intellectually serious. It stressed doing good work. Whatever work you did, you were supposed to do it as if working for the Lord. It had an appealing attitude toward authority. Lutheranism said to honor and obey authority. But Calvinism didn't. Calvinism said to question and judge authority. And if you found that authority unworthy, you were supposed to oppose it. Keep in mind that as a Calvinist, you were one of the elect, as we have studied when we studied John Calvin. So Philip II of Spain, well, he's just a corrupt, hell-bound, reprobate Catholic king. He shouldn't have authority over you, the elect. He shouldn't tell you what to do. So in the 1560s, the Spanish made two big mistakes in the Netherlands. Number one, they raised taxes, and number two, they cracked down on Calvinism. And so the Dutch Calvinists responded. They sacked 30 Catholic churches in Antwerp, and then the revolt spread from there. So Philip II's reaction was to send 20,000 troops to the Netherlands to pacify the rebellion, and their commander was the Duke of Alva. He was absolutely ruthless. Alva created his own tribunal called the Court of Blood. He executed 1,500 men in one day, and that was more than enough to be condemned by the Calvinists. And it now became their godly duty to overthrow the Spanish government in the Netherlands. And so the Calvinists launched a war for independence that would last 80 years, all the way from 1568 to 1648. You can call this the Dutch War of Independence, or you can call it the 80 Years' War. First, there was 10 years of civil war, and that was from 1568 to 1578. And this was a religious war between Catholics and Protestants, and it was also a civil war between the 17 provinces of the Netherlands and the forces of Spain. And of the 17 provinces of the Netherlands, Spain was able to keep the southernmost 10. And so they called these 10 the Spanish Netherlands, and it would eventually become Belgium. And these 10 provinces were the most Catholic of the original 17. The northern 7 provinces formed into a union in 1581, and it was called the United Provinces, or you can call it the Union of Utrecht. And these were the 7 most Protestant provinces, and these 7 would eventually become the Netherlands, and they declared their independence from Spain that year. England helped the United Provinces fight against Spain, and this was one of the motives that Spain had for the Spanish Armada in 1588. So war continued until 1609. Spain finally recognized the independence of the United Provinces. Both parties signed a 12-year truce. Well, the 12 years truce did not make the independence of the Netherlands from Spain official. The truce lasted until the beginning of the 30 Years' War in 1619, and the Netherlands' independence finally became official at the Peace of Münster, and that was part of the Peace of Westphalia, which we will learn about in 1648. Let's talk about the Great European Witch Hunt. After the Reformation, you had the great age of European witch hunting of the 16th and 17th centuries. The Salem witch trials were part of this tradition. The number of witch trials exploded during this time. 100,000 to 200,000 people were tried for witchcraft, and of those, 40,000 to 60,000 were executed. To fully understand this post-Reformation phenomenon, we have to go back at least to the 1230s. What is the relevance of studying witch trials today? Well, in the 1990s, the Harry Potter books were highly controversial in many circles. Many commentators severely criticized Harry Potter because all the characters were supposedly, quote, witches and, quote, wizards and, quote, sorcerers. That's what they were called in the book. Many parents discouraged or even forbade their kids from reading the books because they were all about witches and wizards. Why did so many people view Harry Potter as dangerous? Also, was the word witch really the best way to describe the characters in Harry Potter? It's a fantasy, it's fiction. J.K. Rowling is free to use the word witch any way she wants to. Witch is a cool word that gets people's interest, but didn't the word witch also alarm many people unnecessarily? What if the characters in Harry Potter, even the evil ones, don't actually fit the term witch as people in the 13th through 17th centuries understood it? What if critics and suspicious parents had had a little more historical knowledge to help them assess Harry Potter more accurately? History matters in our daily lives. What was a witch? How and why did the modern concept of a witch come into being? Why did the practice become associated specifically with women? To understand these ideas, we need to go back to the Middle Ages. In the 14th and 15th centuries, court documents show a rise in the number of European witch trials, but not yet on the same scale as the post-Reformation witch hunts. A witch was a combination of two things: a heretic and a magician, specifically a harmful magician. Belief in heretics goes all the way back to the beginning of Christianity, but belief in magic goes all the way back to prehistory. And these two ideas weren't fused together until the late Middle Ages. What was a magical action? A magical action depends on hidden, mysterious, and non-intuitive powers. And it also depends on a certain mastery of physical and verbal techniques. And these techniques allowed you to control these powers, these hidden, mysterious, non-intuitive powers. And they allowed you to be absolutely certain of success. See, if I hit you on the leg with a baseball bat and your leg breaks, that's not magic. That's physics. And if I pray to a divine being, like a god, to break your leg and your leg breaks, that is also not magic. That's religion. But if I put on a special robe and I mutter certain words and do a dance and your leg breaks, that's magic. People believed in magicians throughout the Middle Ages. People believed that magic could be used for good or for harm. There were good magicians and there were harmful magicians. Some examples of good magic were such things as healing and divining the future. Divining the future was considered good magic. Some examples of harmful magic were bringing about sickness or death in people for revenge, bringing about sickness or death in animals, storm magic, creating ice storms and hurricanes, all for the purpose of making people unhappy. Some types of magic were in a kind of a sort of a gray area. For example, love magic, using magical techniques to get somebody to fall in love with you, and using wax dolls and magical potions that you would get the person to drink. And there were recipe books on how to make these love potions, and they specified ingredients, and they also specified proper containers. For example, one book said that you had to serve the love potion in a human skull, and it even had suggestions for convincing the person that drinking from a skull made sense, and it even had directions for keeping the drink from leaking out of the eye sockets. In the High and Late Middle Ages, secular authorities accepted a difference between good magic and harmful magic, and these authorities had tough laws and harsh punishments for people who practiced harmful magic, but they left people who practiced good magic alone. But church authorities weren't so certain about there being a big difference between good magic and harmful magic. Some theologians argued this: people who turned to good magic would be a lot better off relying on God and the saints to solve their problems. But they weren't actually doing anything wrong. So good magicians were using mysterious but natural forces to bring about change. Other theologians, however, denied that there was any such thing as good magic. They argued that all magic was, by definition, harmful, even if it cured a disease, even if it foretold the future. All magicians had to be condemned because theologians denied that these magicians were using natural forces. There was no independent natural force out there. You relied either on God or on demonic sources, one or the other. There was no in-between. God already had his methods all spelled out for people to use: prayer and the saints and relics, etc. Therefore, all magicians had to be relying on demonic forces, even if the effects seemed to be good. And if good magicians were associating with demonic forces, they needed to be condemned. Belief in harmful magic was common since the Middle Ages. Punishments were severe, death. But prosecutions for harmful magic had been rare in the early, that's 500 to 1000, and the high 1000 to 1300 Middle Ages. Back then, there was the law of Talion. And the law of Talion said that if you bring an accusation to somebody, even a capital offense, and you fail to prove your case, you are liable for the punishment that the accused person would have gotten. And this was a great law for cutting out frivolous lawsuits. But it was also bad because you had to be very certain of the strength of your case, because you were putting yourself on the line. Therefore, harmful magic had been difficult to prove in the Middle Ages. Witnesses were rare, and there was never much direct evidence. I mean, unless you could produce a skull full of potion, how were you going to prove that somebody had put a spell on you and killed all of your cows and all of your sheep? So therefore, accusations of harmful magic were actually quite rare. Harmful magicians were in greater fear of being lynched by their neighbors and by mobs than of being prosecuted and put to death in a court of law. At least that's how it started. In the late Middle Ages, 1300 to 1500, you start to see more prosecutions of people for harmful magic. And you see individuals starting to be prosecuted for a very specific type of harmful magic, and that was called witchcraft. So what is a witch actually? A witch is a human being who is able to perform magic not just because he or she has mastered a technique. This person has also consciously made a pact with the devil and has agreed to worship the devil and to become a servant of the devil. And this concept of a conscious pact with Satan was crucial for distinguishing between a witch and a person who is just a harmful magician. In the Middle Ages, other attributes became linked to witches. The killing of small children. Witches supposedly craved the flesh of infants. Witches had familiars, a small dog or a cat or a spirit, and the job of this familiar was to assist the witch and give advice on how to do the greatest harm to humanity. A witch was thought to have a special mark on his or her body as a sign of the pact with Satan. And while your ordinary harmful magician worked alone, witches operated in societies. In the 14th century, these societies were actually called synagogues. In the 15th century, these societies were called sabbats. And local sabbats met in small groups on Friday nights. And this would just be the witches around the neighborhood. But then a few times a year, there would be grand sabbats. And these would involve all the witches of the region. And the grand sabbats, witches could, of course, fly to the sabbats, right? In the 14th century, they flew shovels. And then in the 15th century, they switched over to broomsticks. And Satan himself would preside over these grand sabbats, and the witches would repeat the renunciation of Christianity. And at the end, Satan and the witches would perform lewd acts with each other. And so these beliefs were highly advanced and had deep roots in folklore. And there had been other groups before witches that had been accused of heresy, the Lollards, which we studied in our summer reading, and the Hussites, who we studied in our summer reading. But these had never been accused of practicing harmful magic. Who fused these two concepts, the heretic and the harmful magician, into one single being? Well, this fusion began in the late Middle Ages, and the leading theory is that medieval inquisitors created this fusion, and they did it almost unintentionally. More than 300 years before Pope Paul III created the Roman Inquisition, the Holy Office, the Papal Inquisition had been created in the 1230s, and the Papal Inquisition's purpose had been to convince heretics of their errors. And the Papal Inquisition also handed cases of relapse to secular authorities for execution. The Papal Inquisition was able to be proactive in its approach because inquisitors, they didn't have to wait for a witness to bring an accusation. They had the authority to bring about third-party accusations, and inquisitors were not subject to that law of talion that we talked about. Inquisitors were not put to death if they brought charges and the accused was found innocent, which was not likely because inquisitors themselves decided whether or not the accused was guilty. But if you were caught lying to the Inquisition about somebody, then you were in serious trouble. It was hard for a defendant to identify his accuser, and we've talked about this with the Spanish Inquisition, because inquisitors tended to hold back the names of witnesses. And they also held back any information or any evidence that the accused could use to figure out who the hostile witnesses were. At first, the Papal Inquisition had no jurisdiction over harmful magic. They only had jurisdiction over heresy. Harmful magic was considered the domain of secular courts. Witch trials were always conducted by secular law courts where the Papal Inquisition had no reach, places like England, for example. Over the 13th century, inquisitors tried to expand their jurisdiction. They started claiming that they should be prosecuting people for the practice of harmful magic. And this argument was based on the theological notion that there was no such thing as natural magic. All magicians were invoking demonic forces, whether they knew it or not, which makes them heretics and which means we should be able to get to them. Well, by 1300, the Papal Inquisition had won the right to try people for harmful magic. It was not an exclusive right. Secular courts were still very much around. How did these Papal Inquisition interrogations tend to go? Well, inquisitors would ask these individuals all the questions that they routinely put to heretics, and then they would slide into the area of witchcraft. They would ask questions like, have you ever worshipped Satan? Have you ever participated in secret nocturnal meetings? Have you ever killed any small children? Have you ever flown through the air at night? And of course, the accused harmful magician would deny all of these things. So then torture was applied, and these denials would turn into confessions, and they got a lot of confessions. As a result of all these confessions, inquisitors began to suspect that there existed harmful magicians who were in fact Satan worshippers, who participated in these secret nocturnal meetings, and who constituted a previously unknown sub-society. And this belief spread out from the inquisitors' courtrooms through the executions of harmful magicians, because executions were public events, and the reasons for these executions would be read out loud to everybody. And so this belief also spread through sermons in churches. And in the 14th and the first third of the 15th centuries, historians have records of inquisitors' court documents, and there were actually very few witch trials in Europe, only about one per year. And the accused tended to come from the upper ranks of society at this time. And this suggests that there was not quite yet a social conception of what witches were, because this is still early 14th and first third of the 15th centuries. And these 14th and early 15th century trials almost never started off as witch trials. They started off as harmful magic trials. And then the heresy questions would come, and the accused would deny them, and then the torture was applied, and then you had yourself a witch trial. From about 1375 to 1435, you started to get an uptick in the number of witchcraft trials in Europe. Now, this was still before the Reformation. And these were in areas in which the Papal Inquisition was active, like Italy and France and Germany and Switzerland. And the first theological treatises started to appear that were devoted to the problem of witchcraft. And this suggests that the concept was starting to solidify in people's minds during these years. And these were the first witchcraft trials that started out as witchcraft trials from the beginning. They don't start off as harmful magic trials and then morph. They start out as witchcraft trials from the first moment. And from about 1435 to about 1500, you get yet another uptick in the number of witchcraft trials. And these trials start to involve dozens of people who are executed all together. And the amount of literature on witchcraft and how to identify witches increases at the same time. And during this period, the Malleus Maleficarum is published in 1487. And a passage from it will actually be a test stimulus on one of our tests. And this is the most famous and most comprehensive treatise on witchcraft. Its title, Malleus Maleficarum, is Latin for Hammer of the Witches. And it was written by two inquisitors, right, Heinrich Kramer and Jakob Sprenger. And it was highly popular, and it went through 14 editions by 1520. 3 years before, in 1484, these exact same two inquisitors, right, Heinrich Kramer and Jakob Sprenger, had approached Pope Innocent VIII in Rome. And they secured from him a papal bull called the Summus Desiderantis. And its title is Latin for desiring the highest things, or desiring with supreme ardor. And this papal bull dealt with witchcraft. The Summus Desiderantis did 3 things. Number 1, it confirmed the existence of witches. Yes, witches are real, right? The second thing it did was it authorized inquisitions to prosecute them. And the third thing it did was it instructed secular authorities not to interfere with the inquisitors under any circumstances. So if you were being prosecuted as a witch by these inquisitors, your local court could not interfere. They could not get in the way, could not intervene. So in 1500, those who denied the existence of witches were in the minority, and they stayed in the minority until about 1700. And after 1700, belief in witches began to dissipate. In the 16th and 17th centuries, there was a period called the Great European Witch Hunt. There was explosive growth in witch trials, and cases tended to follow a predictable pattern. An individual would suffer some misfortune. His crops were destroyed, or his animals were dying, or a family member dying. And then the person would remember an unneighborly act that they had done, usually refusing to help a local poor person who had asked for some kind of assistance. And this better off person would come forth and say, I think I know why all my sheep died. Or I think I know why my wife died, or whatever. It must have been that person that I refused to help. This person must have jinxed me with witchcraft. What other explanation can there possibly be? Important. Accusations of witchcraft during this time tended to be made against the most vulnerable people in the community. And that's different from the way it was in the 14th century. Therefore, most accused witches were women for lots of reasons. They were at least 2/3 of the accused witches, and our textbook actually estimates it was more like 75 to 85%. She was usually over 50. She usually had a reputation for being solitary. Maybe she was eccentric. Maybe she was bad-tempered. Demographically, women also had longer lifespans. They were more likely to become old and single. They were more likely to become dependent on the charity of their neighbors. They were more likely to be resented by their neighbors. And when better-off people denied help to these individuals, the better-offs often had a guilty conscience to deal with. So women were often employed as midwives, and the greatest misfortune you can have is the death of a child. So giving birth was risky and dangerous to begin with. Children often died. And so the link between midwifery and witchcraft became very strong. And in France in 1500, it was routine to have all the midwives swear an oath that they wouldn't practice witchcraft. In the book, Malleus Maleficarum, Kramer and Sprenger actually put forth more reasons that women were more likely than men to become witches. Number 1 was their innate, supposedly, don't kill the messenger, right? Their innate intellectual and moral inferiority. Kramer and Sprenger argued that women were very conscious of this inferiority. They were bitter and resentful of it, and they turned to witchcraft as a way to compensate for this inferiority. Also, another argument that they used was supposedly women's sexual appetites made them prone to witchcraft. They had to turn to Satan to meet their needs. So, quiz time. Let's take the most evil characters in the world of Harry Potter. You know, Voldemort, Bellatrix Lestrange, Barty Crouch Jr., the Death Eaters. How would people of the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries have classified these characters? Would they have classified them as magicians, harmful magicians, or witches? Answer, here we go. Harmful magicians. You know, we would tend to think that they would have classified people like Voldemort and Bellatrix Lestrange, Barty Crouch, Death Eaters as witches. But no, the people of this age would have classified them not as witches, but as harmful magicians. Why? 6 reasons. Number 1, these characters were truly evil, so yeah, they did harmful magic. But not one of these characters ever made a pact with Satan in any of the books. Not one of these characters ever served Satan. Not one of them ever worshipped Satan. They worshipped and served Voldemort, but Voldemort was a human being. He was not Satan. And Satan is a major ingredient. It's critical to being a witch.